Many have already written about how a prince should relate to his subjects and friends, and I fear that I shall be considered presumptuous and proud in writing about them too. The more so because in treating this subject, I depart from the rules set down by others. But it being my intention to write a thing which shall be useful to him who apprehends it, it appears to be more appropriate to follow up the real truth of the matter than the imagination of it. For many have pictured republics and principalities which in fact have never been known or seen, because how one lives is so far distant from how one ought to live that he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner affects his ruin than his preservation. For a man who wishes to act entirely up to his professions of virtue soon meets with what destroys him among so much that is evil. So wrote Niccolo Machiavelli in The Prince, a little handbook on how to be a successful tyrant in 1513. What is modernity? Well, here you see the beginning of it, this transition away from the way people ought to be and our aspirations to virtue and goodness and all these lovely ideas, and a transition instead to the way people are. But along with that comes a whole new set of possibilities for the way that we can engineer our society. Maybe we don't need to depend on the assumptions of the ancients the way that we have for so long, going back to Aristotle and Cicero over and over and over again. Maybe there's a new way to understand what it means to be human and what it means to establish a political order and to be a responsible citizen. So we will consider that today as we turn to modernity and modern political thought. We'll consider what that means as we move along. The English Civil War in the 1600s, and what a miserable experience it was. What happened? Well, in the years leading up to it, you saw this growing tension between King Charles I of England and Parliament. Parliament claiming more and more power over England and over the king himself, and the king pushing back, claiming that no, his veto power was absolute, that no, Parliament was not the heart of this government, the king was, and Parliament existed at the pleasure of the king. And he was right about that historically. The only reason Parliament existed was because the king created it clear back in the Middle Ages. And so Parliament really was an extension of the crown, much like the courts were too. So these weren't sort of co-equal three branches of government as we think of it. The king was at the top because he was the king, and Parliament existed at his pleasure, and he threatened to abolish Parliament if they didn't behave. Wow, that's intense. There was also the religious element. The Reformation had come. Charles himself was Protestant, as all of England was, following Henry the Eighth and all of that. The Reformation as it occurred in England. But then more and more, the Reformed tradition in England started to follow what was happening on the continent. And so you saw more and more Calvinist Protestantism as opposed to Anglicanism. They're different. Anglicanism is the Church of England. It's a national church. And from that, you come all the distinct doctrines, which in a lot of ways aren't that different from Catholicism. That's why Anglicanism today looks a lot like Catholicism. There are seven sacraments. The priests wear vestments. It all seems the same, but underneath it's not. Protestantism on the continent is totally different. It is churches that are independent congregations. There's no overarching magisterium. It is solely focused on the Bible and the Bible alone. It teaches that some are preordained for salvation and everyone else is not. And that's that. So the tension over these questions just explodes when Charles marries a Catholic princess from France, and she stays by her faith. She does not convert to Protestantism. Finally, the Protestants in England had had enough. The Anglican Church was too weak and flimsy. The crown was too willing to accommodate Catholicism. And the king had now married a Catholic queen. And so Oliver Cromwell leads up the revolt against the British crown. We say civil war, and we often think of our own civil war in the United States, where you saw, a section of the country break away from the Union through violence. and the attack on Fort Sumter. But that's not exactly what it was. It was a war of rebellion, or if you're a Southerner, it was a war of Northern aggression, whatever. At no point was the Confederacy trying to capture Washington, D.C. to establish its own power. No, it was just trying to leave, right? Not so in the English Civil War. The competition between the Royalists in support of the king and the revolutionaries in support of Cromwell, both were trying to capture the center. Who prevailed? Cromwell, after a long, bloody, miserable war. This famous image of King Charles looking very dignified as he is marched off by Cromwell's troops. And there's the Archbishop of Canterbury praying fervently next to him. What is going to happen? Well, the king went to his execution. Couldn't be exiled. He would refuse to accept the outcome of this. And so these thugs put him on the chopping block, just like a common murderer, and beheaded him. The shock across the nation to see this happen after this horrible, horrible war. Who do we think we are? Well, Hobbes chose his side. He was with the king all the way. And to see the death of the king was the single most horrible event imaginable for him. And it wasn't just for him and his love for Charles and his love for the monarchy that stoked this. It was instead the consequences for the ordinary people across England. What happens when government collapses? That's what civil war really is. It was destruction of the order that protects us, as you see bands of refugees streaming across the countryside, their houses burned, everybody wondering who's a royalist and who's a revolutionary. But above all, the anarchy that ensues. Bands of thugs and criminals terrorizing ordinary folks. What does virtue and the good life and justice and all those classical notions coming down to us from Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and Augustine, what does all that matter when gangs of thugs are, abducting your family and burning your house down? They saw their moment in the chaos of the Civil War, all the criminals, to grab what they wanted and go with it. How could we do this to ourselves? Hobbes said. Maybe it's time to not just rededicate ourselves to the monarchy, but rethink the whole meaning of government. What Hobbes believed he caught a glimpse of, and everybody else did too in this moment, was what he called the state of nature. What is that? He explains in the reading for today. We think of nature, we hear that word, and we think of it in the modern environmentalist sense, right? Pure and good, and beautiful, and always affirming the best things in us, peace and all that kind of thing. That's not what Hobbes saw when he looked at nature. He saw brutality, fear, the feeling of, being way out in the middle of nowhere and no one's around. You're not enjoying the beauty of it. You're wondering, wow, you're thinking anything could happen to me here. What's going to happen? You're alone. You're in competition with others. You're so glad when you go back into town, you return to civilization where there's law and order and peace to prevent the kinds of violence that people will do to each other. Well, suppose there was no law and order. Yeah, we're all nice, we're all friendly, and there seems to be this sense of benevolence between people. But Hobbes says that's only because of government. Take the government away, and what's it like? It's a war of all against all. You know it deep down. Well, to get at Hobbes's teaching, you really have to backtrack a bit and consider what his anthropology is. And so chapter 13 of the Leviathan is the more famous passage included here, but I also included the beginning of chapter 11. What does he say there? Especially when he discusses manners, customs. He says, I mean, not here, decency of behavior, as how one man should salute one another, or how one should wash his mouth or pick his teeth before company. Those are all good manners, of course, but that's not what I'm getting at. Those are small morals, he said. Instead, what I mean is this notion of what human life is for. We've assumed, Hobbes points out, for centuries that human life aims at a certain end or goal. Aristotle called it happiness. And that became just this settled notion in the way we understand the human being. Happiness is made up of the active life of the virtues that we mentioned before. Uh, Not true, says Hobbes. And we've been delusional about this. And it's time to shake off that stuffy old tradition and get real. For there is, he says, no such finis ultimus, meaning utmost aim, nor a summum bonum, or greatest good, as spoken of in the books of the old moral philosophers. And by old moral philosophers, he means Aristotle, as well as Cicero, and all the Christian writers who base their philosophy on those guys. No, there is no purpose to human life, Hobbes said. It's time to give up that notion. What's funny is he doesn't really explain why there isn't. He just kind of says, let's just reject it. But as you'll see, with rejecting it comes a whole new set of possibilities and a possibility for understanding what politics truly is. Nor can a man, he says, any more live whose desires are at an end than he whose senses and imaginations are at a stand. And what does it mean to have all your desires fulfilled? Aristotle would say, well, happiness in the life of contemplation. Christian philosophers would later say, well, worship. Hobbes says, no, no, no. To have all your desires at an end and fulfilled is to be dead. That's it. End does not mean purpose for Hobbes. End means the end. It means the termination of life. Felicity, he says, is a continual progress of the desire from one object to another. Right? What is real peace? It's not the sort of worshipful contemplative state that we are in when we realize our true end. No, no, no. It's death, or at least in this life, it is the knowledge that we will always have our desires fulfilled, one object to another. The attaining of the former being still the way to the latter. Right? It's getting more stuff and more stuff, more supplies, more abundance, knowing that the peace and order and stability of civil society will always fulfill those desires for you, right? I went shopping at Costco yesterday and I was thinking of Hobbes as I was strolling the aisles and looking at the abundance. No. That's happiness. It's abundance, it's ease, it's the knowledge that what you need will always be there. Security and food and supplies, right? Are those the true aspirations of human nature? Again, forget virtue and all that. There's no such thing, Hobbes says. Real felicity is security. The cause whereof is, he says, that the object of a man's desire is not to enjoy once only and for an instant of time, but to assure forever the way of his future desire. And therefore, the voluntary actions and inclinations of all men tend not only to the procuring, but also to the assuring of continual life, and differ only in one way, which ariseth partly from the diversity of passions in diverse men, and partly from the diversity of the knowledge or opinion each one has of the causes which produce the effect desired. So that's a whole different way of looking at people. And yet, Hobbes would say, isn't it true? I mean, just look at us. Don't you want security? Don't you want abundance? What are we really about? A restless desire for power, power upon power that ceaseth only in death. So take everything you've assumed from Aristotle and Cicero and the whole gang and everything we spent the last 4 days talking about, really, and throw it out. Keep the religion, of course. Hobbes had no, hostility toward Christianity. He just didn't like Christianity that was formed in its philosophic assumptions by Aristotle. He was all about sola scriptura, right? And his Protestant ideas of the state that had been common in England at the time. So yeah, there you go. All that said, what is the state of nature? Well, it turns out we're all equal. I mean, just look at those two guys in the painting, and the title of the painting is A War of All Against All. It looks brutal and awful, but they are equal to each other. Isn't that lovely? Don't we love equality? Well, what Hobbes means by equality is our equal ability to kill each other. Oh, well, that's not the equality I was hoping for. Well, that's what he means. Nature hath made men so equal. Remember, Aristotle didn't hold that, right? Aristotle thought that there was a natural hierarchy in people. So did Plato. No, Hobbes said, with reason, the Enlightenment, modern age, we realize that nature nature hath made men equal in faculty of body as well as mind. As that through there be no found sorry there be found one man sometimes manifestly stronger in body or quicker in mind than another. True, but the weaker have just as much ability to kill the stronger. So, the big guy with a club, he's pretty dangerous, but wait till he's walking by a cliff somewhere and you see a big rock. Then what do you do if you're one of the weaker sort? You discover the equality between you by throwing the rock at his head. So that's how Hobbes looks at it. And as to the faculties of mind, setting aside the arts grounded upon words, and especially the skill proceeding upon general and infallible rules called science, right? Leave aside the political art of the polis, as Aristotle described it, and let's turn to political science, because it doesn't make mistakes. It moves forward with mathematical precision and gives you absolute answers. It's not about prudence or virtue, it's about knowledge. And knowledge reveals something tremendous to us about our desire for security and the way that we might get it. We'll get to that in a second. But yeah, it says, I find a greater equality among men than of strength. For prudence is but excellence, which equal time equally bestows on all men in those things they equally apply themselves to. That which may perhaps make such equality incredible is but a vain conceit of one's own wisdom, which almost all men think they have in greater degree than the vulgar. It's like those funny public opinion surveys, like, was it 70% of Americans believe they're smarter than the average American? There you go. That's because they don't do science, Hobbes says. But as we see, from this equality that is revealed to us by science, political science, he means, we also see the sources of diffidence. Diffidence being the desire that two people have for the same object. And in the state of nature, those objects are scarce because it's rugged, wild wilderness, right? And so from diffidence comes war, the fight. And by war, you think armies on a battlefield, but no, that's not it for Hobbes. War is pretty much any struggle, any fight at all over scarce resources. And those resources are so scarce that anybody who fights over them are fully prepared to murder each other. And whoever is left standing is the one who gets it. So it's almost like a survival of the fittest sort of thing. But Hobbes, it wasn't about the fit, right? It was just a sort of a logical outcome of struggle. It didn't really go anywhere. Charles Darwin proposed survival of the fittest to explain Darwinian evolution, right? That's not what Hobbes meant exactly. Instead, it was more just explaining the predictableness of human behavior. Did he mean that people were evil? He's often misunderstood as saying that people are fundamentally bad. No, that's not true. He wouldn't see it that way. He'd say, no. He'd say people are predictable. There's nothing evil about you if you want food and shelter and security. That's just what people want. It doesn't make you selfish. It just makes you predictable, right? But that predictableness in people is useful, as we'll see, for designing government. Not a regime, not a city, but government. It's different. It's institutions and it's power to protect us from this kind of state. So, of the civil states, there is always war of everyone against everyone, he says, in page 17. Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe and fear and terror, not of each other, but of itself, what happens? We are in a state of war. So as much as you might fear the other guy and he's going to kill you and take that last apple or whatever, isn't it better to fear the state instead? Then what happens with these two guys in the state of nature? They become friends, right? But no sooner, there's no basis for friendship or association or love, back to that point, or anything that we assume in civil society until there is a government. That's the only time we put our weapons down and work together and be good neighbors. No sooner. War, he said, consisteth not in battle, right, or in actual fighting, but in a tract of time wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known, and therefore the notion of time is to be considered in the nature of war, as it is in the nature of weather. Right? What is war like? It's like the weather. It just happens. There's a good or bad. It's just a fact, right? Sometimes it's raining, sometimes it's not. So too with war. War is the norm. War is natural. That's the state of nature. The times in between, he said, are peace. What is peace? Is it the end of all things? Do all things desire peace? No, he turns that completely on its head, that classical teaching on peace. It's the other way around. What is peace for? It's time to reload. It's time to sharpen your weapons and get ready for the next war. That's all it really is. So, what is war like? Whatsoever therefore is consequent to a time of war, he says, where every man is the enemy to every man, the same is consequent in time wherein men live without other security than what their own strength and their own invention shall furnish them withal. In such a condition, there is no place for industry. And why would you make anything? Because the fruits thereof is uncertain. Oh, yeah. Whatever you create that's useful, somebody's going to kill you and take it. So why bother? And consequently, there's no culture of the earth, no agriculture, nobody's growing anything. There's no abundance. There's no navigation of rivers, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea. No commodious buildings, right? This is the rugged wilderness. There are no buildings to live in. You're lucky if you find a hole in the ground. No instruments of moving and removing such things that require much force. There's no knowledge of the face of the earth. No account of time. There's no arts, no letters, no society. And what is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Very famous line from Hobbes. You might have heard it before. Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And we are always compelled by one motivating force: the desire for happiness, virtue, the good life, God? No, fear of violent death. And Hobbes says, look, it's a very simple demonstration. Just look at yourself. All your notions of virtue and all these sort of lofty ideas, what do they matter when someone is pointing a weapon at you? All that just kind of disappears, right? Well, he has to account for courage and benevolence in people. There are examples of this. He says, there's some explanation for it. There's some motivation. And he actually calls courage just vainglory. Now, it's when young men become inflamed with notions of their own strength, and they take for granted the fact that they are mortal. They ignore what's really at stake here, which is their lives. What does courage matter when you're dead? That's a beautiful thing for those who live after you, sure, but to you, it's nothing. You're nothing. That's it. You're just dust. Maybe there's a heaven, maybe there's a hell. Hobbes didn't go into that. He'll grant it as revealed religion, sure. But in that moment, right, all that matters is preserve yourself and do everything you can to keep on preserving yourself. The law of self-preservation is fundamental. It might seem strange to some men, he says, that has not well weighed these things, that nature should thus dissociate and render men apt to invade and destroy one another. Why would someone say such a horrible thing about people? Isn't Aristotle so much more lovely, right? Isn't Cicero so much better? Well, consider yourself, he said. Just look at your own passions. What passion is most fundamental and most powerful as a motivator in you? Benevolence? Pity? Anger? No, none of those can compare with fear. Fear is the passion to be reckoned upon. Fear is the bedrock of all human existence. Everything else is added on extra. But fear is real. Fear is rock solid. But it is upon that rock, Hobbes seems to say, that you can build a whole new kind of political order. Someone else might object. Was there ever such a state of nature? He says, well, I don't mean it historically. I mean, it probably was historically, but I don't mean it that way. What I mean is, under the surface of every civil society is this condition, and you know it, right? When the lights go out, when there's a natural disaster, when civilization collapses like it did in the English Civil War, as Hobbes pointed out, then you see the state of nature. It's always with us. It's always lurking under the surface. So you better be really glad for the civil order that you've got, and you better hope it's always strong enough to prevent this. As bad as a tyrant might be, Hobbes says, At least you and your neighbor are not at each other's throats, right? And again, if you think this is a horrible thing, just look at yourself. Why do you lock your front door at night, even though there's police out there? Why do you lock your chests, he says? Why do you always have a little bit of caution and distrust around strangers, even though everybody's relatively friendly out there? That's it. You know the state of nature is real. Just look in yourself. Is there anything unjust about this? No, it's just normal. It's just how human nature functions. And you see the state of nature too between nations. What's it like? Though there had never been any time wherein particular men were in a condition of war, one against another, yet in all times, kings and persons of sovereign authority, because of their independency, right? There's no authority over them, right? Except God, but he doesn't seem to dictate much to them. They are on their own. They are in continual jealousies and in the state of postures of gladiators, right? They have their weapons pointing and their eyes fixed upon each other. That is, their forts, garrisons, and guns and frontiers of the kingdoms, and their spies infiltrating each other's kingdoms, even when they're allies. This is the posture of war, he says, even if they are not actually fighting. War always exists. War is the fundamental order of reality. It is out of war that we build a civil society. The passions, he said, do incline men to peace. But what is that peace? It is submission to power. This is the frontispiece to Hobbes' original edition of the Leviathan. It's a famous image. You've probably seen it before. What do you see here? Here's the king, right? And on one hand, he holds the sword of executive power, absolutely. On the other hand, he holds the scepter of the church. And those two things are inseparable in his person. This is a large reason for Hobbes's anti-Catholicism, because the church, Catholic Church, claimed and it established centuries back in the Middle Ages, that it was superior to the state. Not in the sense that it controlled the state or told kings and republics what to do, but at the same time, it claimed out its own territory. And it was a superior thing. It was a higher thing. Nonsense, says Hobbes. Any church worth anything to the people ought to be a state church, right? Hence the Church of England, right? And established churches across Europe that are gone now, but back in his day, they were all over the place, except for the southern, the Catholic nations. But even they tended to choose the Catholic Church as the chosen favorite, even though the church itself didn't see it that way, right? Kings do not appoint bishops, right? The Pope does, that kind of thing. What do you see though that the Leviathan here is made up of? That's what Leviathan means, the state. Look closely, little people. It looks like chainmail, but it's actually a whole bunch of little people, all of their faces turned toward him. The idea being that the state is the security of all the people, and it's also made up of their collective wills. That's what the Leviathan is. Then there's the face of the Leviathan. And it's funny as you look at it, you'd think, okay, it's Charles I, right? Who Hobbes admired so much. But actually, no, it's Hobbes himself. He put his own face on his Leviathan, which is kind of odd. But wow, how far we've come. Where is Aristotle in this? We're not talking about cities anymore, the polis. We're talking about nations. We're not talking about citizens arranged into regimes. We're talking about government. This is a whole new way of understanding the political order. Was Hobbes successful? Very successful. Although you don't necessarily attribute this all to Hobbes, this was kind of the natural development of things, especially after the Peace of Westphalia. That was a real turning point where you saw the international order finally acknowledge states. But Hobbes really was the philosopher of that movement. Well, it sort of happened on its own. He was the one who gave a deeper explanation for it all. So, look at your passport. Look at a map of the world. What do you see? These multicolored nations with borders and capital cities and governments and administration. There you have it. That's the legacy of Hobbes, and that's the modern world. Can you imagine a world without states, without nations? Can we ever go back to the cities that we saw in the ancient world? It's just impossible to imagine. It looks like this is going to be the way things are from here on out. Well, that was Hobbes. But then you had his counterpart of this era, John Locke. Locke was quite a bit younger than Hobbes. He didn't experience the brunt of the English Revolution the same way Hobbes did, and so he didn't really focus on fear in the same way. His two treatises on government was a really provocative book. The Leviathan, I think most people just found it a bit strange. There were churchmen who condemned it and everything, but ultimately it was in praise of monarchy. And so as Charles II returned to England and take back the throne from Parliament, Hobbes had been the royal tutor to Charles, and he became an official within the court. Locke, though, didn't have nearly the same experience. He was a university guy. In fact, if you go to Oxford today, you can see Locke's library. Hobbes was never a university type. He was a private tutor and sort of a sort of roving scholar. But Locke was very entrenched in the university. He was a physician by trade and then became a professor there. But he too got really involved in these questions of power and the state and what was possible beyond the ancient way. He too rejected the classical view of man and the city and all of that, just like Hobbes did. But he went a whole different direction with it. The two treatises on government. The first treatise was written in response to a guy named Sir Robert Filmer, who wrote this long book called Patriarcha. And it's a long, boring slog that argues basically that since Adam was the first man, as we see in Genesis, every king is descended from Adam, and therefore every king has a divine right to rule. There's the divine right of kings argument. Locke thought that was complete nonsense, and he wrote this massive first treatise on government, line by line, taking apart Filmer's argument. By the time he was done with it, no one was really reading Filmer anymore. And then everyone realized, wait a minute, aren't we all descendants of Adam? Like, how do kings draw their line? That makes no sense. And Locke said, oh, I guess I've wasted my time. What am I really saying here? Hence the second treatise on government. And he's got a whole different idea of this state of nature. So again, both of them are thinking about this in an attempt to try to get at the heart of the true origins of political society in an attempt to define what government ought to be based on this view of human nature. But it's not human nature derived from philosophy, the way that Aristotle and others did back in the day. It's human nature taken from this abstract idea of the state of nature. What do we look like when there is no civil society? Hobbes answered the question one way. It's the war of all against all, fear, terror. Locke answers it a different way. To understand political power aright, he says on page 18, and derive from its original, we must consider what state all men are naturally in. And what's it like in that state? And what does he say? All are equal, a state of equality. So he agrees with Hobbes on that much. But it's not equality in our ability to kill each other. Nonsense. Locke rejects that idea from Hobbes. No, instead it's equality and it's sort of this recognition of our equal humanity. So that's a little more familiar to us. That's a little more like the modern democratic American view of equality. You just look at another person, right? And you see a person with all the same feelings and aspirations as you. There you go. No one having more than another. There being nothing more evident than that creatures of the same species and rank promiscuously born to all of the same advantages of nature and the use of the same faculties should also be equal one amongst another without subordination or subjection. Unless, of course, the Lord and Master of them all should come down and say, I picked that one. But God hasn't done that, Locke says. Yeah, kings like to say he has in their own family line, but there's no evidence for this. I've seen no evidence. Nope, all are equal, meaning that inequality is an aberration. It's something made up after the state of nature. What else do we find in the state of nature? We are ruled, we are governed there. It's not total chaos, like Hobbes said, but no, we are governed by a law of nature. He quotes extensively the Anglican philosopher named Richard Hooker, who makes much of the same argument. But yeah, this law of nature speaks directly to our conscience. It speaks right to our reason. And what does it tell us to do? Preserve all mankind. And you hear it just crystal clear. And you hear it even better in the state of nature than you do in civil society. It's just quieter there. And society doesn't muddle your judgment about things. To think that, you can treat someone else badly or whatever. Hobbes took that idea from the society that he lived in. Locke says, well, no, you didn't go all the way back to the real state of nature. Go back further, and you find this crystal clear sense of conscience about how people ought to treat each other. Follow that law of nature that says, preserve all mankind. The state of liberty, he says, is not a state of license. No, it has a law of nature governing it. What else does the law of nature say? Preserve mankind, but also respect the rights of others. Rights? Hobbes didn't say anything about rights. Locke says, no, there are rights. They are natural rights. And what are they? Very famous phrase from Locke. He says it a few times: life, liberty, and property. Where'd pursuit of happiness go? That comes later. That's Thomas Jefferson and the American founding, as we'll see. For Locke, it's property. But that's a very good formulation if you think about it. Life, that's obvious. That's your life. Liberty, that's your ability to move around and kind of do what you want. You're free. Property, that's the fruits of your freedom. That's what you acquire in the state of nature. You pick the apples off a tree. You put your labor into those apples, and that makes those apples yours. You shoot the deer with a bow and arrow. The deer is yours, whatever. So the rights to life, liberty, and property. And you see these with just perfect clarity in the state of nature. And Locke just invites you to expand your imagination and see what it's like there, and you can see it. But there are problems. Not as bad as Hobbes said, but there are bad folks out there. There are thugs and criminals who ignore the law of nature. Even though it speaks very clear to their minds as well, they reject it. So what are they? They are toxic. He says they're like vicious beasts that would devour everyone else. They're criminals before the law of nature. So what does that mean you do if you're in the state of nature? You identify that person as a criminal, and you call up a group of your fellow residents of the state of nature, and you go after them, and you punish them. But the thing is, because there's no government here, there's only one punishment for that kind of criminal: death. The death penalty is the only penalty. Once the will of the state of nature is executed by you and other followers of it, you disband. So what does all this start to sound like? This rugged, wild wilderness, survival, but at the same time, that sort of clarity and goodness that emerges to the top. He entertains the possibility that there never was such a place, just like Hobbes did, but he says, however, there is such a place right now. He says it's America, right? Once all the world was America. He's thinking of the remote, rugged frontier, which in his day was still largely, unexplored and undiscovered, at least by, the English settlers. But in time, much of what Locke described would become the American frontier, or more importantly, it would become the Wild West, courtesy of John Wayne, right? What is the Wild West like? It's such a huge thing in American folklore, but if you study the history of it, it's all true. There's no law and order out there. It's the wilderness. It's dangerous. But there are good guys. There's the guys who are ready to step up at great risk to their personal safety to punish the offender. That's it. And so what does he do? He walks into the saloon and says, I need me 5 men, right? And Black Bart and his gang has robbed another bank. Let's go get him. Because Locke argues that thievery, that itself is an assault on not just one's property, but on their life. And so you are justified in capturing the thief and hanging him high, right? With vigilante justice. Wow, what a different world we are seeing now. Not just with Aristotle and Cicero, but between Hobbes. It's the interesting thing about modern political thought is that it really kind of accelerates the pace of ideas. The time between, say, Plato and Cicero is centuries. This was only one generation, and yet we get radically different notions of what government ought to be, of what the state of nature is. And each of them has its own distinct influence. So what is the purpose of society then, according to Locke, if things are this way? If a man in the state of nature be so free, he says on page 20, you see the little subtitle there. If he be so free as has been said, and if he be absolute lord of his own person and possessions, equal to the greatest and subject to nobody, why would he part with this freedom? What kind of cowboy moves to the city and settles down? Why would you do that? Why will he give up this empire and subject himself to the dominion and control of any other power? To which it is obvious to answer that though in the state of nature he hath such a right, yet the enjoyment of it is very uncertain and constantly exposed to the invasion of others. For all being kings, as much as he, everybody else, are all kings in the wilderness, every man his equal, and the greater part no strict observance of equity and justice, the enjoyment of whatever property he acquires has in its state, as in this state, very unsafe, very unsecure. This makes him willing to quit this condition, which, however free, is full of fears and continual dangers. Not of everybody, but those bad guys out there, right? It's a few criminals instead of a war of all against all. So this makes him willing to quit his condition, however free, because it's full of fears and continual dangers. And it is not without reason that he seeks out and is willing to join in society with others who are already united or have a mind to unite for the mutual preservation of their lives, liberties, and estates, which I call by the general name. There it is again, property. That's why we form civil society. So for Hobbes, we form society and we join the Leviathan state because we want protection from each other, right? And it's a very difficult question how we even make that transition. I didn't include the reading, but later in the Leviathan, he says it's this process of you and I, right? We both got our weapons. Like, all right, you put your weapons down first. No, you, no, you, no, you, right? Because if I put my weapons down first, you're just going to shoot me, right? No, no, that doesn't make any sense, says Locke. People will join civil society not out of fear, but out of a desire to preserve life, liberty, and above all, property. Consider what that means, though, for the human passions. Hobbes looked to fear. Locke, he doesn't say it, but he looks to greed. We want to preserve our stuff, right? And that's the only reason we would give up liberty, on the expectation, of course, that we keep most of that liberty. The only thing we give up is, of course, the right to execute the offender. But even then, we retain it. Even then, if somebody's breaking into our house, we're not going to wait for the cops to come if he's about to kill us. We shoot him first. But thankfully, most of the time, there's sort of a steady administration of law, Locke says. But notice, laws are always chiefly and fundamentally concerned with people's property and their stuff. The great chief end, therefore, of men's uniting into commonwealths, he said, is putting themselves under government. It's the preservation of their property, to which in the state of nature, there are many things wanting. And he lists those things, and we'll just skim them here. But first is the want of established, settled, known law, received and allowed by common consent to be a standard of right and wrong. So instead of executing the criminal, how about you sue him? That's messy and exhausting and expensive, but hey, at least there's no blood on your hands. Right? Isn't that so much better? Locke would say. Second, in the state of nature, there is want of a known and indifferent judge. Right? Who's going to judge and mediate between these conflicts? In the state of nature, there's nobody. In government, there is. Right? There's a set of civil laws, and there are judges ready to rule on them and executives ready to enforce them, so you don't have to. Thirdly, in the state of nature, there often wants power to back and support the sentence when right. There's the executive power. So he's really listing the branches of government here. Thus mankind, he says, notwithstanding all the privileges of the state of nature, being but in an ill condition, while they remain in it, are quickly driven into society. Right? I want to preserve my stuff and my steady accumulation of stuff. That's why I joined civil society. And then he goes on to say the things that are missing in the state of nature, but you get his point. What is Locke describing here? What form of government is this? For Hobbes, it's obviously a monarchy. Hobbes was open to other forms. Maybe they could do what the Leviathan could, but he didn't think anything could do it as well as a king. But Locke calls for a republic again. And at first glance, you think, well, yeah, the Roman Republic, right? Not exactly. What he is calling for is not a republic of virtue and self government and offices and duties and statesmen. He's calling for a modern liberal republic. In fact, if you scan through this reading and really the whole second treatise on government, if you read the whole book, Locke never once uses the word virtue, unless I'm missing it. Tell me if you see it. He doesn't talk about character. He doesn't talk about the ability of self government. He seems confident that his system can work anywhere, like anywhere at all. Yeah, it worked for ancient Romans just as well as it would work for Somalia, just as well as it would work for anywhere. It's transferable that way because greed is a fundamental passion in people, no matter where they are, no matter what their cultural mores or religion is. Greed is fundamental. Well, didn't Hobbes say the same thing about fear? Well, he too thought his system was transferable. So that's what you see here. The ancients were aware that political systems and the regimes that you had in your city had to match the kind of people that you had. That's why Plato goes into such depth about the psychology of democracy, right? Locke doesn't pay any attention to that at all. He just says, consider the passion of greed, consider how much you want to preserve your stuff and your life too. Yeah, that's true, but primarily your stuff. And you see that my system works anywhere. So we make the transition from the classical republic to a modern liberal republic. Immanuel Kant, many years later, famous philosopher, would put it this way, reading these two, he'd say, many say a republic would have to be a nation of angels, like Rome, or the Roman Republic anyway, because men with their selfish inclinations are not capable of a constitution of such sublime form. But precisely with these inclinations, nature has come to the aid of the general will established on reason. Forget the order of the passions and the ability to govern oneself personally. Just listen to reason. And this is revered even though impotent in practice, right? Just consider how much you like to keep your property. That doesn't matter if you're a good person or a bad person. You've got the same desire deep down. And in fact, Kant says, the problem of organizing a state, however hard it may seem, can be solved even for a race of devils, if only they are intelligent. Consider what that means. A race of devils, a nation of devils. Even they can be made just and have their freedom secured by Locke's political system. Kant doesn't mention Locke by name here, but he's definitely thinking of that kind of government. It's three branches, it's institutions that check each other, and each one has a distinct role and separation of powers, right? Polybius seemed to be saying this. He doesn't mention virtue at all either, but still, in practice, it was assumed. And you can tell by Cicero. The Roman political system, for all its laws and institutions, still depended on the type of people that Romans were. And when Romans stopped being that type of people, the republic collapsed and became an empire, as Augustine pointed out. So, wow, liberal republic. To which the third major figure of the Enlightenment era responds, you're both wrong. Here comes Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau was of Swiss descent, and he left his native Switzerland and came to France in the 1700s and just became this sort of drifter. He was kind of a bum, didn't really know what he was doing with himself. And according to legend, he tells the story himself in his Confessions. He was walking through the Academy of Dijon, which had been established by King Louis XIV many years ago to try to elevate the Enlightenment in France. And he saw an essay contest. And the question of the essay was, has the Enlightenment served to improve morals? And he had this profound epiphany. He claimed he saw flashes of light and started writing furiously, no, no, no. The Enlightenment has corrupted us. It's an amazing achievement, sure, but it hasn't been good for human beings. What we need, above all, is not reason and the establishment of states based on passion. Hobbes and Locke are just a couple of monsters, Rousseau said. What we need is a return to the classical notion of virtue and the community that the city used to be. He knew all the Enlightenment stuff, but he was fundamentally he based his thought on classical teaching. He read Cicero and Plato and all the ancient historians, Polybius and Plutarch and the whole gang. And he thought they really had it right. So here's the question. Now that we're in the modern world and that states are just the thing, thanks to Hobbes, thanks to the Peace of Westphalia, how do we go back to the ancient way? How do we undo the direction that modernity has gone? Or in other words, back to that map of the world. How do we erase all those countries, right? And go back to being little polities, little cities in the ancient sense? Well, Rousseau knew that that was impossible. But there were other possibilities here. There were other opportunities to try to remake what political society was. All right, let's go back to the state of nature. Rousseau was keenly conscious of nature, and he was famous for taking these long walks by himself, just for the sake of the walk, just for communing with the trees and the shrubs. That was unusual in his time. Usually, if you go for a walk, you're looking for shrubs to make drugs with, or you're headed somewhere, or no, he would do it just to be silent and commune with the trees, right? And this helped him formulate a whole new idea of the state of nature. What is man in the state of nature? Full of fear of violent death and violence at each other's hands, as Hobbes said? No. The rugged frontiersman carving out an existence and desirous of preserving his property and punishing offenders of the law of nature? No. He is what Rousseau called the noble savage. What does that mean? It's this pre-political man who is also pre-social. He has no language, no sense of time, no sense of property. I mean, it'd take eons to develop in this person's mind. He is solitary, he's alone, and he's perfectly, perfectly happy, and has absolutely no interest in the affairs of civil society or civilized man. No concept of it. Eons and eons pass of human beings living this way in the woods, running naked through the woods, free and unburdened by all the things that oppress us today. Wow. So while the state of nature is a horrible place for Hobbes, well, it's sort of a rough place for Locke, but you can learn certain things from it. What is it for Rousseau? It's basically heaven, or something like the Garden of Eden, at least, that we fell from. He really does sort of rework the Genesis narrative, but in a more secular, enlightened kind of way. Rousseau was a complete atheist, as everybody was in this era. So he borrows, though, that biblical story to kind of make his point. So what is this thing? No language, no sense of time, no property, no family. So one thing that Hobbes never accounted for in the state of nature, if we all live in mortal fear of each other, where do babies come from? He didn't really consider that. Presumably they happen, against the will of the mother in some horrific, you can imagine. But Hobbes didn't say that, though. And even if that was true, it wouldn't be enough to sustain any kind of human population. Well, Rousseau's got an answer. Man and wife meet, or say male and female meet, I should say. They copulate, and that produces offspring, and then they never have anything to do with each other again. There's no reason to believe that sex connects in any way to marriage for Rousseau. Marriage, where'd that come from? Society. It was made up later, along with everything else we assume is natural to human beings. True man in the state of nature is an absolutely blank slate, and he's happy. So I can't resist whenever I teach this, thinking about this lone biped wandering through the woods. This illustration isn't quite accurate. If you read Rousseau, he says he's hairy. What does this remind you of in American folklore? It's Bigfoot. It's exactly what Sasquatch is. And it's the place that Sasquatch is always held in American folklore, clear back to Native American times. Is it real? Is it not? I don't know. I'll just speculate. But as far as the idea of what Sasquatch is, it's exactly what Rousseau is describing. And it's remarkable how similar it seems. Well, people do leave the state of nature, but why, according to Rousseau? By accident. There's no desire to seek safety or preserve property. No, they don't need any of that. There was some cataclysm, a volcano perhaps, he speculates, a meteorite, who knows. But that drove people into communities. But they were tribal societies, and they always held on to a bit of the state of nature in them and stayed close to nature and didn't really, try to build nations or anything like that. Had little use for technology. And so much of his work, he looks at explorer notes. Consider the Hottentots of South Africa and the Dutch explorers who settled there. The Dutch, with their magnificent castles and ships and guns and all their technology and sophistication. And they adopted one of these Hottentots as their own and tried to teach him the ways of civilized man. And what did he choose after all that? He went back to his tribe. So it is with indigenous people. What does that tell us? What civilization is really superior here, and which one is inferior? The Dutch think they're superior, but Rousseau says, no, it's the other way around. The Dutch have corrupted themselves with civilization and technology. It's the Hottentot who is superior. Could any of those guys in their fancy hats and all their guns and traps and everything survive in the wilderness with just their bare hands? No way. But the Hottentot could. He's muscular, he's robust, he can catch an animal with his bare hands. He has little use for tools, just a simple sword is all he really needs. And he's happy. It's the Dutch who are miserable. So what a lesson this is. Well, what do you do though? Once you realize this, well, Rousseau said, once you see the state of nature and our progression out of it, you realize just how changeable human nature is. Locke and Hobbes before him were concerned about getting human nature right. You had to see it for what it truly was. Rousseau says, no, it's a big mistake. What you need to do is see the ways that you can change human nature. And if we can perceive the distance between the noble savage and civilized man, as we call him, like these two, then we can see how much more human beings can change, fundamentally change. And we can change them into citizens. Hence, the general will and the social contract. What does he say from this little book? I included just a couple of passages. Lost my place. Hold on. Stop. There it is, page 21. He begins with what he calls the social compact. I suppose men to have reached the point at which the obstacles in the way of their preservation in the state of nature show their power of resistance to be greater than the resources at the disposal of each individual for his maintenance in that state. That primitive condition can then subsist no longer, and the human race would perish unless it changed in the manner of existence. So he's saying, why did people join civil society? Well, because they changed in such a way that they started to need civil society. Right? If it weren't for that change, if it weren't for that cataclysm, that volcano or whatever it was, they never would have banded together into groups. They never would have developed language, concepts of property, exclusivity in marriage, children, family, home. All these notions are made up and they may never have happened. But because they happened, we started to need protection. We started to need protection of property, everything that Hobbes and Locke talked about. As men cannot engender new forces, but only unite and direct existing ones, they have no other means of preserving themselves than the formation by aggregation of a sum of forces great enough to overcome the resistance. So what do? We start to form civil society, and the best kind is a general will. Forget the protection of your property. That's a mistake. Forget your security. That's all. You're missing the point. What do you really want when you join civil society? You want to recover what you lost when you were like this. I'll keep Bigfoot, I guess. When you were like this, something like it. You can't go back to the state of nature, but you can recover something that feels like the way things were back then. That helps you gain a sense of wholeness. And what that means is the formation of a democracy, back to democracy. But a democracy where there is no dissenting minority, but everyone becomes a part of the whole. Everyone finds their place within the whole. And they take this oath. Each of us puts his person and all his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will. And in our corporate capacity, we receive each member as an indivisible part of the whole. So where's the government here? Where's the king? Where's the assembly? There's none of that. It's just one big democracy acting in unison. At once, he says, in place of the individual personality that we had in the state of nature, what happens? This act of association creates a moral and collective body composed of as many members as the assembly contains votes, and receiving from this act its unity, its common identity, its life, and its will. The truest assembly is the assembly of everybody. Obviously, that won't work for big modern nations. That means those modern nations have to be divided up into little polises again, or polities is plural. This public person, so formed by the union of all other persons, formerly took the name of city, polis, and now takes the name of republic, or body politic. Back we go to the wholeness that we lost. It is called, of course, a state when passive, sovereign when active, power when compared with others like itself. So this is a whole different direction we've seen. He seems, like we said, to go back to the classical view, but not exactly. Is the general will fallible? Can it make mistakes? He says, well, it can be mistaken. It can have bad information. It can, but ultimately, if the general will is well designed, it's democracy that never behaves like a mob because it's been so carefully conditioned to do that, to always be good, to always include all the members within itself in such a careful way that there's never a dissenting minority. Again, you start to wonder, how can there not be a dissenting minority in a group of people? There always is. And every time democracy happens, that's the great challenge, is trying to account for that. Well, that's why Rousseau is widely regarded as the father of totalitarianism. So sweet as his ideas may seem, and as eloquent as he is, he writes beautifully, he really does call for a system where everybody finds their place within the whole and nobody is outside of it because they're all forced into it. He is, of course, the major figure behind the French Revolution. He didn't live to see it. He died before the revolution broke out. But Maximilien Robespierre and a lot of the revolutionaries like Danton and many pointed back to Rousseau as the guy who introduced this notion of the general will that France had to become. Of course, the revolution itself was a wild hodgepodge of ideas. It was all very complicated. But the general will was kind of the overarching notion that all the people in France had to be turned into a general will. Well, what do you do about the minority that don't fit, especially the old nobility, starting with the king and then all the nobles? Well, that's what the guillotine is for. Quick, easy dispatch of the problems in society. And once all the king and all the nobles and all the church had been beheaded, then who came next? Anybody suspected of countering the general will or questioning it or not going along with it? And so the blood flowed as the blade came down again and again and again in this violent attempt to create Rousseau's vision. What would Rousseau have said? I don't know. You can only imagine. He didn't call for this kind of violence in his writing. But isn't it the natural consequence? His famous line is that how do you get the general will to happen? People must be forced to be free. And he says that knowing full well it's a oxymoron, forced to be free. But at the same time, that's the only way forward to true freedom. Otherwise, you're protecting property. Otherwise, you're protecting, civil laws and all these kinds of things, and limiting the power of the king. And all. That's all a waste of time. No. What you need to do is make people pure citizens. So much citizen that there's nothing left of the human. Just jettison your own aspirations and make everyone a part of the whole. How do you do this? With a legislator. In order to discover the rules of society best suited to nations, a superior intelligence, he says, second column, page 22, superior intelligence beholding all the passions of men without experiencing any of them is needed. But so who does this? What is a legislator? It's like a superhuman power. This intelligence would have to be wholly unrelated to our nature, while knowing it through and through. Its happiness would have to be independent of us and yet ready to occupy itself with our happiness. And lastly, it would have in the march of time to look forward to a distant glory and working in our century to be able to enjoy in the next. You're talking about an absolutely selfless person who can transform all these people into citizens. Who could do such a thing? Well, back to these guys. Not in every case. Some dictators in the modern times have just been out for themselves and or really trying to do the best for their country, but sort of lost their way. But others, consider Joseph Stalin, social experiments, right, to try to test the bounds of human malleability and discover just how different people could be. The Cultural Revolution under Mao Zedong's watch in China, and this attempt to sort of totally re-engineer everything we thought to be natural and normal in the human person. Wow. I'm not sure why Leonid Brezhnev is on there. Ignore him. But anyway, the rest of them really do end up being Machiavellian tyrants in their own way, yes, but also kind of Rousseauian legislators too. Because what does a true legislator do? He who dares to undertake the making of people's institutions ought to feel himself capable, so to speak, of not reforming the institutions, but changing human nature. Changing human nature, of transforming each individual who is by himself a complete and solitary whole into part of a greater whole from which he is the man, he in a manner receives his life and being. Wow. So Hobbes and Locke wanted to reform government to work better. Rousseau doesn't want to change government, he wants to change people, right? If democracy doesn't work, it's not the government's fault, it's the people's fault. So they need to be reformed and altered, not just taught more virtue, but completely transformed. Grab hold of that changeability of the human being and make him what you want him to be. Then, then you can have a general will. Then you fulfill the social contract. So, how far we've come. What a place we've wandered into now. The city was so simple, it was so clear, it had its problems, but the Romans kind of figured out how to instill virtue and offices and the path of honor. And then Christianity came along and you have a supernatural basis for that self-government. And now where are we? When we come back, let's transition to the second part of this class on Monday and consider the way that these modern ideas play into the American founding, as well as the ancient ideas, as well as the Christian ideas. And we'll consider the influences of each, some more than others. I don't think Rousseau had that big an influence on the founding compared to Locke. I don't think Locke had as big an influence compared to Aristotle, but we'll consider that as we come back. So yeah, read the next part of Responsible Citizenship on America, and then have a look at the documents of the Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson's letters, and we'll see traces of political philosophy in that. I went a little over today, my apologies, but I'll see you Monday.